Hello everybody, it's Courtney. I'm here with another design team project for Trinity Stamps. Today we're going to be creating a pretty simple card with a hidden message using the Picture Sentiment stamp set. And this stamp set is so much fun. You can come up with your own little puzzles and have the recipient also be able to solve the puzzles. So I'm starting off with a piece of Neenah Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and I'm using my MISTI, arranging my images to create a sentiment thankful for you. So I'm arranging those in the center of my card panel here, and I am going to go ahead and stamp these out with Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it is a Copic safe ink. I did have to stamp this twice just because I didn't ink it so well. This is a brand new ink pad, so it's a little juicy, and I was too afraid that I was going to press too hard, but instead I didn't press hard enough. So once that was stamped out, I am going to go ahead and cut this panel down with a stitched rectangle die, and this is the second largest in the set, and then we'll also use the larger stitched rectangle die later on. So I went ahead and ran that through my Gemini, and we'll move on to the coloring, and I kept the coloring very, very simple for this one. I am just going to do basically 2 or 3 color blends for most of these images. Going to start off with the water in this little fish tank here. Just going to be doing a little bit of shading with the B14 towards the bottom portion of the tank. Blend that out a little bit further with the B12. And then I will finish off with that B00 that we had used in the beginning just to get the paper saturated so that the colors blend a little bit easier. Next, moving on to the little fish there in the tank, I'm going to use some oranges for these to make these little goldfish. Because they're such tiny, tiny images, I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, and I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to the bottom portion of the fish. Blend that out with the mid-tone and then keep just the top portion for that highlight color. For the sand or dirt or whatever it is on the bottom of the tank, I'm just going to go in with a solid color here. It's such a teeny tiny area that shading is really not necessary here, and the coloring on this card is not the main focus. Going to switch over to some C markers for the top portion of the tank, and I'm just going to keep a center highlight here. So I'm going to go right in with my darkest color because the grays blend so well together. Starting off with the C7, blending that out with the C5 and leaving the center for the highlight for the C3. Going to keep those same grays out, but instead of using the C7, I'm going to use the C5 as my darkest color for this little gas gauge, I think it's called. I don't know. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading to either side of the inside of the gauge, I guess, if that makes any sense, because this would most likely be clear. So I'm just going to add a little bit of shading with the C5, C3, and C1, leaving the center portion white. But I am going to go quickly with my colorless blender just to get rid of those harsh lines. Because the C1 is the lightest gray that I own, you can certainly use a lighter gray if you have it. Going to keep those same shaded areas on either side of the little gas gauge, and I'm going to switch over to some reds. Again, going directly in with my darkest color and just blending that out each and every time. Just being really careful because reds tend to bleed, so you don't necessarily want to saturate the paper all that much. And it's really, really tiny, so you'll just want to use the tip of your marker. For the number 4, I decided to bring in some greens, and for letters and numbers, sometimes it's a little hard to figure out where you should put your shading. And to be quite honest with you, I haven't mastered this. So I just basically put shading wherever I want. As long as there's some contrast and dimension, nobody's really going to be able to tell that you used a different light source or didn't even have a light source, which is probably what I did. So I just added some shading wherever. For this little sheep, I guess it would be, or you, I guess, I'm going to switch over to some warm grays. And again, gray markers tend to blend really easily, so I'm going to go right in with my darkest color and add a little bit of shading to his face and his legs, as well as his little hooves there. I believe they're called hooves. Also a little shadow where his ear is hanging over the wool. And then where it is indented, around the outer portion of his body. I'm just creating little C's or little V's to add some texture, and then a few little C marks or flick lines right in the center. And I'm using the darkest color sparingly. As I go down, I'm going to add more of those little C's. So I didn't want to add too much of the dark. So for the W5, I'm doing the same thing. I'm just extending those areas out, and you can see that I'm adding even more of those little C's. Next, for the W3, extending those shadows out a little bit more, and then for the C marks, I'm going crazy with it. Then I'll finish it off with the W1 and finish off the highlight for his little face and his little legs and ear. And then I'm going to cover up the entire area where the wool is. Finally, I'm going to bring in the colorless blender, and you do want to be very careful because we all know that the colorless blender is not actually a blender. I'm going to very, very quickly go over that area to kind of mush everything together, and this will kind of give it the illusion that it's kind of puffy. Gonna just add a little bit of shadow underneath him just to kind of ground him a little bit with some C markers. And then I'm gonna go ahead and cut another panel of the Neenah Solar White with that larger stitched rectangle die. So next we're gonna go ahead and start assembling the card here. So I'm going to bring back out my MISTI and take another piece of white cardstock here, and I'm taking some of the sentiments that actually spell out what I'm trying to say with the pictures. And I'm using my MISTI here just because I find it easier when there's this many sentiments that I kind of have to piece together to line them up. You can certainly use an acetate grid. I think they're called like templates or something for your MISTI. But what I typically do is I line it up the best I can. And then when I close my MISTI door, I kind of take a look at the door because on the MISTI there is, and most stamp positioners, there are grid lines there. So I just kind of make sure, use those grid lines to make sure that everything is lined up perfectly. I'm going to go ahead and stamp this out with some black dye ink. And then I'm going to cut this into a small strip, but a very long one. I want it to be much longer than the actual sentiment itself. I did add a little bit of a dash line between the thank and the full. Being these were two separate stamps, they were spaced out a little bit, and it's obviously not spelled correctly because we want the pictures to spell out the sentiment. So onto the assembly, I'm going to go ahead and take that larger stitch rectangle die and adhere that flat down to an A2 size note card. And then I'm going to be popping up this smaller panel here that we had colored. But I want my little hidden message there to be tucked behind it. So I'm going to take my Scotch foam tape. I'm laying down where I want that sentiment strip to be. And I'm going to add the Scotch foam tape all around it. So I'm going to use full size foam tape on the top and the bottom, and then I'm going to have to kind of cut it down to make sure that that sentiment strip is going to be really tucked in there well. You don't want to leave too much space, but you don't want it to be too tight of a fit either. So you want it to be that space that we're leaving, you want it to be probably about, well, I don't want to measure, but you want to have plenty of room to be able to slide that in and out, if that makes any sense. So once all my foam tape was lined up correctly, I'm going to go ahead and put my little sentiment strip aside, remove the backing from the foam tape, and center that directly onto that larger stitched rectangle die that we already have down onto our card base. And then you can make sure that your little sentiment strip there is going to slide in and out pretty easily. I cut off any excess, and then I wrote the word pull. This is optional, but just so that somebody knew what to do with it. And that is it. That is the card. Very simple, but it has a little hidden message just in case they can't crack the puzzle. That's it for today, guys. Thanks so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.